to where it's originating, just about at the top of that vertex. Okay. Let's move them around here like that. Down a little bit. Again, it's always good to base something like this off of one strand because it keeps the weight flow of something like hair. So I go to another view and kind of make some more tweaks. Let's put this out there like that. We get something like this. And basically we need to create a couple more of these. This is the basis for the hair, so it's all a bunch of vertical lines kind of cascading down around her. So using the same kind of shift, move, clone, rotate, adjust methodology, we add on another, let's say 6 vertical lines to start with. Tweak them until we get something that looks like this. So I'm going to drape this one strand coming off the crown to be up and around her shoulder. And then I've influenced the rest of them to kind of follow her shoulder weight as well. And again, this is like kind of the outside edge of the hair. We're going to add depth to it by adding more vertical lines as well on the inside of her hair. So next I need to add the cross sections or the rest of the lines, and the way to do that is to go to modify, create line, and turn on snap, making sure that it's set to vertex, create a couple lines. Now you want to make those lines go all the way around the circumference of your shape. And again, you start off with them being corner, and you can select and then go in and hide them. Go back to your vertices, right click and hit smooth. Unhide all, and it brings back all your vertices and lines. Now you repeat this, kind of running your way, making your way all the way up the shape. And adding any lines you need to, but try to keep your, you don't want to go in and add a vertex until eventually you get it looking like you want, with all your vertical and horizontal lines connecting to create one valid or complete spline cage. Now, what makes a spline cage is when vertices form 3-sided or 4-sided closed regions. So as you can see here, the cage is made up of mostly four sided shapes except for the top of the head where it kind of has to be a corner. And that's the dilemma, and that's the kind of the challenge when you use spline cage, is try to keep them as many built up as quads as you can, because when you go to triangles it tends to do weird things with the surface. The other thing you want to do with the spline cage, or the splines of the spline cage, is to keep them as unified as you can. You want to make kind of, if you can connect them, then go ahead and connect them. For example, I connected these spline cage, or these splines, all into one. And this one here is all one spline cage. Even this one that goes kind of up the middle, actually right here in the back, is broken, but it's only because you want to try to make this, if this was connected to this, it would be so smooth, it'd be kind of hard to see. So again, with the shape I've built here, it's like this volumetric mass of hair. The next step is to apply the surface modifier. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about the spline cage. When you create the spline cage, its success depends a lot on whether or not the vertices are coincidental or occupying the same space. For example, when you look here, these lines, there's two different vertices there, but they need to be occupying the same space. A good way to get vertices to occupy the same space without actually welding them is to use fuse. It's one of those little known or little used tools in Max that, well, at least I don't use it. So if you select two vertices and hit fuse, they'll kind of serve the purpose of like a weld and just kind of occupy the same space. They're not going to actually weld to each other. Another thing to be aware of when you deal with spline cages is your first vertex. If you look at these little boxes here, that means that vertex is first. And whenever you have an open line, you want to make that the first vertex as opposed to a line in the middle. Now, for the most part, all these splines in this shape have one end to the other as a first vertex. And as you'll see with the surface modifier, if you apply it and it looks kind of weird, you can play around either with flipping normals or reassigning a vertex to be first when it wasn't. So with the spline cage done, you apply the surface modifier by just hitting surface or digging for it under your modifier list. And you have, hopefully, a nice clean shape around your spline cage. Now if you hit F4, you can see that the spline cage is still there. It just now has been turned into a patch model. Make sure the steps are what you want. For example, if you want to go higher, it'll make the mesh, of course, higher resolution, but it'll be more costly. So for what I'm going to do with this hair, I'm going to keep it at 3. And something else to consider, the differences between a patch model and a subdivided surface model using Mesh Smooth. Whenever you increase the steps in Mesh Smooth, it's about a 1.5x jump in resolution. However, when you use Mesh Smooth, it's always going to be a 4x with each iteration, and we'll look at that later on. But another reason why you don't want to have the complexity too much is that when we convert this to a mesh, look, if you were to put an edit mesh modifier to it right now, or edit poly, you'll see that the resolution depends on that. So if we go back down the stack and decrease the steps, you can see how the end result edit poly is less complex, but the more you go, the higher it is. And you still want to keep this relatively low res, so as you deal with it, it's it's easier to adjust. And it's also, when you get to the point of texturing, it'll be easier to texture and easier to rig if you were to animate this kind of thing. So you probably noticed I used an edit poly modifier as opposed to converting it to an edit poly object or converting it to an editable poly. I'm not really a big fan of edit poly. It's just, for different reasons, I've used edit mesh so much over the years, but I'm slowly kind of warming up to edit poly through pressure from more more of the discrete guys and from other artists than any other reason. However, it does have some nice functionality with this new build of Max 7, because as you can just see, if I would have put an edit mesh instead of an edit poly, it does not give me, it keeps the visible lines, which are important when you deal with a subdivided surface or deal with mesh moves. It keeps the visible lines as they were as a spline cage. And for this, I actually want to convert all these symmetrical lines into visible lines. So a little kind of side effect of using edit poly is the fact that it does that work for you. So now that we have edit poly,